All right, so we're going to talk about making fonts fly. We already had a bunch of things that we were doing for Google Fonts in our Swiss Performance plugin, and so we just added one more, and I thought, it'd be great to review all these different things that you can do with fonts, and that, of course, then also reminded me of system fonts, and so from the top of things that I think you probably shouldn't do. So system fonts is the idea that you just use fonts that are built into the operating system of whatever device people are on, which is fantastic for performance because no fonts have to be loaded and the fonts are already there. So boom, everything renders lickety split, right? The problem is that all of the fonts that are used on Windows and Mac by default are proprietary fonts. Back in the day, I don't know that Mac OS even had the same fonts as Windows. It definitely doesn't have the same defaults, but it does have the old, whatever you want, the old classics, I guess you could say, Arial, Times New Roman, those kind of fonts. And some people would advocate that also, but that's not necessarily what some of the other performance people would recommend. But they do have a nifty list of the most commonly available fonts on the W3 Schools website if you search for web safe fonts. And you can certainly go that route if you want to, but just know that they're not going to be available on all devices. Even more so with, I think, Android and potentially even iOS may not have those fonts. I should have looked. I did look the other day. I just don't remember on my phone whether or not, because you can actually, I had no idea you could even look up your fonts on a phone, but you can. Yes, so that's right. Those are available on iOS. So they should be available on Android, I would think. But there's going to be most of the Linux users in the world, which includes things like Chrome OS, potentially, and the Steam Deck, which is gaining popularity among gamers, and similar devices that are popping up in that same realm, are not going to have those fonts. Well, so what? They'll use something else, right? The problem that comes up is that different fonts use a different number of pixels, and when your text uses a different number of pixels, that causes layout issues when they don't match up. If your layout is fluid enough, you might get away with it, and apparently my friend who I have alluded to, who recommends system fonts, has not ever run into that issue. I have, and I hate it, and it's not fun. So that was back before web fonts were really much of a thing. Now they're a thing. 70+% of websites use them, and I think that's just peachy. For everyone else, the majority of people that are using web fonts, and especially Google fonts, it's important to get those optimized because that can slow down your website. It's not necessarily as huge as images, but it can be. When we first, I think it was on the redesigned site for UIO, we had, I want to say 300-400 kilobytes of fonts, at least. And part of that was because we were self-hosting two fonts. The one that's proprietary and then the Google font we were self-hosting, but it wasn't subsetted, which is something I'll get to in a second here. But yeah, so it can be a big deal if it's not done properly. Google gets you, I would say, halfway there, and that depends on when you implemented it and how closely you followed Google's instructions. So the first thing, um, or next thing, I guess, would be font formats. Back in the day, and on desktops and most devices, you'll have either TrueType fonts or OpenType fonts that are being used. But on the web, we have a format called WOFF, WOFF, the Web Open Font Format, and the second version of that actually compress those fonts. So it's kind of like gzip for CSS and JavaScript. It just takes your existing font and compresses it. I believe there is some extra functionality of WOFF, but it's not super important to know that. The main thing to know is that WOFF is supported everywhere. Even Internet Explorer 11 supports WOFF, so no one even, well, most sites don't need to support that even, so WOFF is pretty ubiquitous. Then the other one that I mentioned briefly is called subsetting, and what that does is splits your font into chunks based on the characters. So most web fonts are going to support UTF-8, which has millions of characters for, I mean, Chinese alone, I think, has hundreds of thousands of characters. Um, so you got Chinese, Japanese, Greek, Cyrillic, all those different variants of fonts, and then all this, even with our standard alphabet, you go to some of the European countries and they've got the tildes and all the different accents that are included. And yeah, so there's a ton of different characters. So subsetting, like I said, it splits those up into chunks based on dialects and some other different things. It potentially, if they have, like even emoji are UTF-8 characters. So if a font supports those, even those could be in a separate subset. So that's a big deal. It can take a font from 100 to 200 kilobytes to 25 to 50, somewhere in that range, maybe even smaller, depending on the font. And then you even have, with fonts, you have different variants for bold and italics. And so you have to be careful with how many different variants like that you're using on a given site. So it's careful, or important to be careful how many different font weights you use on a given page, because you often have to load a font file for every single font weight. So if you use bold and bolder and there's anything from 100 to 900 usually on those, so that can get pretty cumbersome as well. And I wouldn't recommend using more than two, probably. So, being generous, you could maybe go three, but I wouldn't. I would stick with two at the most. If you can get it down to one, fantastic. But our site uses two, and that's decent. It's pretty quick. So actually, really quick now with the thing that I'm going to talk about at the end. All that said, with all the different things that you can screw up yourself with using too many variants of fonts, then you've got Google half working against you. And like I said, that depends a little bit on when you implemented it and whether you followed their instructions. Or if you're using a plugin that may or may not follow their instructions. And so to get a web font into the browser for your visitor, you have to have the CSS for that font. And that CSS looks a little something like this. It's usually bigger, but sometimes it's not too crazy. But again, that depends on the different font weights. So this is just a single font weight. If we had two or three font weights, then multiply this by 3. So you'd have 6 different things in here. And then add Latin and Cyrillic, and I think I said Greek. Yeah, I think that's one of the other variants. And yeah, all the different things. And it adds up pretty quick. But anyway, but it's got to get the CSS first, right? So that might be in your theme CSS. Ours is not. We get it um, from, or used to get it from Google Font API server. And to get that CSS, the browser first has to find where that server lives on the internet via DNS and then connect to it over HTTPS. So 2 operations necessary to get the CSS. Not so bad. You get your CSS, and you'll notice something about this URL versus the place where the fonts are actually stored. fonts.googleapis.com versus fonts.gstatic.com. And they're different, which means you have to do that whole song and dance over again. Thanks, Google. Another DNS request, another HTTP connection, and finally you can download your font and render that text on the page. And all that time, if you have an older implementation of fonts or you just didn't follow their instructions, the text was invisible to the user. Awesome, right? Like I said, depends on when you implemented it, how much you followed the instructions. I feel like I'm beating a dead horse, but there it is. But they've improved some of that. Notably, they've implemented display swap by default. That's their default recommendation now. And so that makes your URL look a little bit different with display swap at the end. And that makes it so your text isn't invisible while the font is downloading. So it'll use a system font temporarily. And then when the web font loads in, then it'll switch over to that. That's not a huge deal. Some people get a little bent out of shape about that. It can cause a tiny bit of layout shifting, but not really that much usually. But that does illustrate the whole issue with system fonts in the first place, that if you have a different font, then layout shifts from what the developer intended, unless they went and tested all sorts of different devices. But yeah, they call that a flash of unstyled text, I believe, FOUT, versus our good friend, the FOIT, flash of invisible text. Not nearly as bad as a FOIT, but some people don't love that either. And so another thing that can be done is to pre-connect to those particular domains. And if you're using the default implementation, that means a connection to 2 different servers for two different things, for the CSS and also for the fonts. And that's great. That helps out quite a lot, but it doesn't get us quite to perfection. And it could definitely be better. And the other big elephant in the room, privacy. With the GDPR relying on Google Fonts, may or may not get you in trouble, especially if you're in the European Union. So if I can help it, I would rather not deliver the fonts from Google. Back in the day, there used to be a benefit of using Google Fonts in that browsers would cache the fonts. And yes, there's a lot of different fonts, but if you're using one of the more popular ones, there's a good chance that the browser already had that font loaded from another site. Well, that's apparently a security risk, so they don't allow that anymore. So it really doesn't matter where you load your fonts from as long as it's fast. And Google's actually not the fastest. Shock and surprise. I'm not shocked, but some people might be. With that said, you might as well host your own fonts, but it's best to do it on a CDN if you can, unless your server's just crazy fast, which might be the case if you're using a solid web host like WP Engine or Rapid Cloud or Rocket.net, something like that. You should be a pretty good server that could handle delivering fonts pretty quick. At least as good as Google, if not faster. And that's something that you can do with our Sys Performance plugin pretty easily, because self-hosting your fonts is not something that you can just be like, yeah, I'm going to go do that. There's also a plugin called OMGF, Optimize My Google Fonts, that will do that for you as well, allow you to self-host your fonts. Last I used it, it was a little bit fiddly, but it seemed to work pretty good. Just, it seemed like there was more configuration than there needed to be, but it worked. The feature in Swiss works automatically. You turn on the optimize fonts feature, go visit your home page. It detects all the Google fonts you're using. And then if you check the self-hosting option, it also then downloads those fonts to your server and delivers them from there instead of from Google. It also inlines the font CSS, this stuff up here. It inlines that into the HTML. That way that eliminates an HTTP or not. Yeah, an HTTP request, not necessarily a connection, because at this by the time the fonts start to load, you've already connected to your server or your CDN typically. So it's not a huge deal, but it does eliminate one download for a tiny little file like that, which is the other thing that just boggles my mind with that. I kind of get why they have that separate, but I still don't understand why they're on separate servers, separate domains, separate servers naturally, but not separate domains. And then in case you didn't have the font display swap thingy in your Google Font CSS, Swiss will add that for you. And it will make sure that your visitors pre-connect, that the browser pre-connects to the server. Mentioned you can use Swiss to self-host the fonts, or if you're using our CDN, it automatically does it for you, which is something we did last year, I think. So we just transparently swapped that over. And one better, something that I don't mention in the article, we even use Bunny fonts, which mimics Google fonts. So that way, if there was any conceivable way that Google could still fingerprint something from your visitors without having the IP address or the user agent, then it wouldn't be going to Google anymore. It'd be going to Bunny CDN, which is a EU-based company and is much more privacy friendly in that regard. So yeah, lots of cool stuff there. And then the last greatest thing, there's a few different plugins out there that can do preloading. Swiss is now one of those. Perf Matters, you can do that. I had a really hard time a while back when I was looking for preload plugins, finding a good free one. I'm sure there's some out there, but I couldn't really find a fantastic one. But we have it in Swiss now. So if you have an UIO license that comes bundled with, and you just drop your font URLs in there, and off you go. And I'll actually show you how that works. No, not if they're already self-hosted. If you're using EasyIO, it will still route them through EasyIO, but then they're just fetching it from your server anyway. So not doing anything necessarily for privacy, but potentially making it faster for people throughout the country and throughout the world to access. Yeah. No, it doesn't do anything much for that if you're already self-hosting fonts. Um, it does give you the opportunity to preload them though, and that took our site was already getting like a 92 on GT metrics, and preloading fonts took us up to a 98 on performance. So it was a decent boost. I can tell, at least looking at it, because I don't see that minuscule little flash of unstyled text. It's pretty small for me because I have it already cached, but it's there if you don't preload. So preloading completely eliminated that. We had originally, I mean, it was like a hundredth of a second layout shift, and now it's nothing. There's no layout shift whatsoever. So if you want to preload your self-hosted fonts, what you do is well, I guess I can just show you on this site anyway, even though I've already done it. So you right click and go to inspect, which opens up the Chrome Dev Tools. And you come over to the network tab, select fonts and reload. And here are the two fonts that we're using. And so then we just right click on one of these fonts, go to copy URL, and then we go over to WP admin, and you go to the Swiss performance settings, and we scroll down to the preload assets. So it's right below the font optimization stuff. And you just drop the URLs in here just like this. So those same two URLs we saw right here, those are the two that we have here. And you save, and that's it. If you were to have put in the original Google font URLs, Swiss would update those automatically in the preloads. So that wouldn't be a problem at all, even though the fonts move domains and paths and everything else. It figures all that out for you. And I think that's all I've got to say about fonts.